Well, there, as they say in Maine, that was wicked good, Scott. Yeah, some kind of wicked good. There are several layers and levels of goodness in this continuum of cultural expression. Wicked in Maine is a good thing. There's wicked, then there's wicked good, and then some kind of wicked good. That was some kind of wicked good. And you may have noticed the aya, because how many of you have heard of that expression from Maine, aya? Thank you. Aya is an expression in Maine, and there are multiple versions of this expression. It's A-Y-U-H, and the variations are geographic, age-related, and situational. Aya. Aya. Yeah. They're all different, kind of like wicked good, n'est-ce pas, or for those of you who have been up to Canada. Yeah. Well, 10 days ago, I returned from Maine, where kitchens, rocking chairs, and cribbage boards are the places that invite conversation. In my family home, the kitchen was where all important family issues were aired, discussed, and debated over a meal. Perhaps that happens in your kitchens too. The rocking chairs on our porches, or what my grandparents called it, the piazza, or living rooms were where we sat in silence to mull things over, be together in silence, or tell the stories of the day or of days gone by. Conversations were more interesting and enlightening than television, except for Sunday nights when we watched Lawrence Welk and Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins and Jim. Just as the mother lion protects her cubs, you can protect your children with an insurance policy from Mutual of Omaha. I didn't know at that tender age that I would be living so close to where Marlon and Jim were. Rocking chairs and hot air balloons inform some of the stories I'll share with you this morning. I believe that our stories, yours and mine, and our narratives are our sacred texts. Stories are a mean of communicating who we are, where we came from, how we grew into the beings we are, and how we continue to grow. Sometimes the mythical journeys of our lives are riddled with humor. Even those stories rising out of pain or sadness often have room for a smile or a moment of laughter. We laughed a lot as a family, and often it was humor that got us through the day. How many times have you heard or said, I don't know whether to laugh or cry? Sometimes we do both. I've been known to laugh so hard that I cried. I used to get in trouble for laughing at church. As a child, the first God I was introduced to did not have a sense of humor. And in response, I found church hilarious. While my parents had a well-developed sense of humor, religion and church was very serious business. I don't think that it was a coincidence that we lived on a hill overlooking the school and the church. It was called, and still is, Pious Hill. Can you imagine the pressures of growing up on Pious Hill in a mill town? It's probably a good thing that I didn't learn the myth of Sisyphus until I went to college. In his book, Between Heaven and Mirth, James Martin writes, "A light-hearted spirit is an essential part of a healthy spiritual life and a healthy life in general. When we lose sight of this serious truth, we cease to live life fully, truly, and wholly. Indeed, we fail to be holy, end quote. As it turns out, the hilarity of the church and living on Pious Hill may have planted the early seeds of a path to UU ministry. Author and spiritual explorer Jill Jepson links humor and spirituality too, and finds that humor informs and embraces spirituality because humor is based in truth. Humor requires a keen observation of everyday life, and humor is playful with language, it's revealing, and it's healing. There's a lot of truth in rocking chair wisdom, whether or not that which is told is factual, made up, a fifth or sixth hand telling of an exaggerated story that gets better with every telling. We find humor is paradox, hyperbole, and surprise, especially when there's a nugget of truth in it. In Maine, being a native is taken very seriously. The status cannot be earned. A native is born with that status. And I think that may be true. There are some similarities to Iowa. I've seen these bumper stickers of the state of Iowa, and it says native. So I think you may understand this part. Using polite language in Maine, if you're not a native, everyone else is from away. Using less polite language, everyone else is either a flatlander or from Massachusetts. And the only special dispensation given in Massachusetts is if you're a player for the Red Sox. Granted, primarily because most of the Red Sox are from away too, which is wicked good compared to being from Massachusetts. I do love Massachusetts, if any of you have New England roots, but I am a Maine native. My brother-in-law was a New Yorker. It was always bothered him that after living in Maine for 30 years, raising 2 children with my sister, and being actively involved in the community, he was still referred to as that guy from away. My husband, James, questioned the status of being a Mainer with my father over a game of cribbage. Cribbage conversations allow the most difficult conversations because the game always takes priority over the debate, and the focus generally stays on the cards, shuffling occasionally becoming aggressive to make a statement. Now James, in his very detailed way, asked my dad of 90 plus years and a native of Maine, if a native couple conceived a child while living in Maine, moved away during the pregnancy, had the child out of state, and then moved back to Maine immediately after the birth, and then that child spent its entire life in Maine, would that person be a Mainer or from away? My dad paused, looking at his cards, looked up, paused again, and said, well, they wouldn't be a native, that's for sure. You may think this is exaggerated or unfair. It may be both. And there's truth in the usually good-natured teasing and pride that comes when one lives a lifetime in a summer destination state and lives to tell about it. I'm happy to be at home in Iowa and proud to be a Mainer for life. What nuggets of truth are held in the stories of your journey? A good story worthy of being passed down from generation to generation includes a keen sense of observation. My grandfather, Fred McKusick, was a man of few words and often said more with a glance, a shift of head position, silence, or an ever so slight smile. You had to really pay attention because it looked something like this. He was subtle, old-fashioned, Maine hilarious. My parents and grandparents built neighboring cabins on Davis Pond, and there was a short walk between them. Once, Tom, my brother-in-law from New York, had some relatives visiting from Colorado, and please know with glee that Maine natives experience calling someone from the Rocky Mountain state a flatlander. Anyway, we were preparing a barbecue one afternoon, and Tom realized that he had lent out the family grill. So I walked Tom's nephew Kevin to Gramps' place. I was there for support and to translate nonverbal cues. Kevin asked if we could borrow a grill. Gramp nodded and pointed to the woodshed. We went out to the woodshed, took the grill. As soon as we got back to the other camp and prepared to light the grill, Tom realized that in lending out the grill, he also lent out the charcoal. So he sent us back to Gramp, who nodded and pointed to the woodshed. And when we got back and before we could do anything, Tom sent us back for lighter fluid. We dutifully returned, but we didn't have to wait for the look and the point. But before we got that, Gramp paused and do I need to give you a bunch of chicken too? That story still makes me smile. In fact, when I was in Maine 10 days ago, my brother even told this story. And I said, I'm going to tell that story in Des Moines in a couple of weeks. I remember it every time we have barbecue, especially in Maine. And don't quote me, but barbecue is a completely different and wonderful experience in Iowa. What details in the story of your life are foundational to who you are and how you move in the world? There's a famous storyteller from Maine who is no longer living, but his name was Marshall Dodge, and he chronicled the life on the coast of Maine in his album, Bert and I. You don't see it very often, but you can find it. It's worth listening to. And his observations are exaggerated, yet they sound like people I know, and it relates a way of life unknown to tourists and sometimes even to the younger natives. I'd like to share one of his stories called The Lighter Than Air Balloon. I was a spectator up to the Skowhegan Fair last summer. They had stock car racing, diving from the high platform, and teams of horses pulling against each other. Every summer, they got a feature attraction. Years ago, they had William Jennings Bryan up to relive his Cross of Gold speech. And this year, the feature was the releasing of a lighter than air balloon at 12 o'clock on the last day of the fair. Howard Perkins and I won the raffle to take her up. After a few words of instruction, we climbed into the gondola, cut the mooring lines, and we were out of sight in about 4 minutes. We were out over the ocean in an hour when the wind veered north and took us back over the land. So we let some of the gas out, and come down to see where we were. Saw a farmer plowing in the field. Well, I leaned over and I cried out, "Where are we?" "You're in a balloon, you damn fool." Playing with language, twisting and turning meanings and expected meanings, shifting the understanding of what is said or what is heard awakens us to the structure of language. The use of creative misdirection makes us think about our assumptions and the meanings of words. What we experience in a moment of sadness may shift when the retelling lifts up humor and the possibility of healing. After my grandmother died, my grandfather, Fred, was frail and depressed. He stayed at home. My parents cooked and cared for him so that he could stay at home. And I hadn't lived long enough or fully enough to really understand the depth of his loss. I just knew that he didn't sit on the piazza anymore. The little smiles were gone, and the twinkling eye stories were replaced with empty stares. I spent a weekend with him so that my folks could have a weekend off, and decided to go through Nana's recipes and make something special for him for dinner. I found a recipe that I remembered as being one of his favorites. I went to him in the living room and asked, "Do you like chicken and gravy?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you like homemade cornbread?" And he said, "Yes." Decision made. I went to the kitchen and cooked my first chicken and gravy and cornbread made from scratch. It felt like a huge accomplishment then. Now I know that cornbread's really not a rough recipe, but you do have to get it just right. I proudly served his country dinner on a TV tray and joined him sitting in my Nana's chair as we ate and watched Lawrence Welk. I was filled with anticipating his enjoyment of the meal that I prepared for him. He ate the chicken, and he pushed the cornbread aside without touching it. I was crushed. I was speechless and didn't know what to say. I took his TV tray and my disappointment into the kitchen, cleaned up the dishes, wrapped stuff up and put it away, wrapped the cornbread gently, put it away. Later, when my feelings had eased, I decided to bring it up gently. "Gramp, I noticed you didn't have any of the cornbread I made for you. I thought you said you liked cornbread." He looked at me, paused, and said, "I do. I didn't say I wanted any." And then that little smile came back, and the twinkle appeared as he reached for his pipe, filled it with cherry blend, and struck a match to light the aromatic tobacco. I laughed, called him a rascal, and challenged him to a game of cribbage. He won that contest too. As I recall, in the middle of the game, he said, "I win. Want to play again?" And we did. And we enjoyed pan-fried cornbread with eggs in the morning. Are there stories from your life that begin in sadness and move towards healing and laughter? May we always take ourselves seriously enough to take ourselves lightly. May we find festivity and sustainability in the stories of our lives that celebrate goodness and humanity. May our laughter and lightness be for gladness, healing, and the holy days we create in our singing, dancing, and telling of our stories. It is here that we discover and grasp the sacred in our lives. May it be so.